Hi, y'all. Okay. Hello. So, let me get situated. Okay. So, for this first lecture video, I'm going to be discussing sociological imagination. I'm also going to be going through some major and early sociologists, um, for this first week, as well as the next video lecture will be on culture. So, present this. All right. So, sociological imagination basically stresses and analyzes the social context people live in. In other words, early sociologists like C. Wright Mills, Emil Durkheim applied sociological imagination and expanded upon it. C. Wright Mills was a major sociologist that did expand upon sociological imagination. And in a lot of his early writings and research, he essentially underscores that sociologists should look at social locations as their primary resource for analysis, in other words. Stated differently, C. Wright Mills essentially emphasized that sociologists should simply look around us, look at our environment, look at certain locations, and analyze that from a research standpoint, and further analyze the people who occupy those specific locations. And analyze what they're doing, how they're behaving, what their culture looks like, what their specific language looks like, how they express themselves. Really, the list goes on here on what we as sociologists specifically look for. Um, so again, sociological imagination stresses and analyzes social context people live in. Um, it is an approach that sociologists use to view the world, institutions, groups, and individuals around them. Um, Stated differently, sociologists look at social locations and places that are occupied by people. And these social locations could be really anything. Sociologists have analyzed and studied prisons. They have analyzed and studied schools and classrooms, um, restaurants, coffee shops, bars. Really anything could be considered a social location for sociologists here. Okay. Second important point here is properly defining sociology. This is straight from your textbook, this definition, but sociology is the study of society and human behavior. It is also a part of, and this is part of my definition, it's a part of the social sciences, as opposed to the natural sciences. The social sciences being sociology, anthropology, psychology, for example. Natural sciences being biology, chemistry, list goes on there. The social sciences aims to examine and understand the social world in a variety of ways, right? Psychology, understanding the social world through the mind and the aspect of the mind. Sociology is more of understanding people in their environments, right? As opposed to people and their how they think, right? So, the particular goals of science, the first goal here is to explain. And this is science broadly. So I'm not just talking about sociology here. I'm more so talking about the social sciences as well as the natural sciences. And in both cases, that type of science is meant to explain something. Um, and once that explanation might emerge, then you get broad generalizations. broad generalizations about something, for sociologists could be this broad generalization could be a broad generalization about a group, right, in their specific environment. And from this broad generalization, sociologists can look at patterns of behavior. Patterns of behavior being really anything at this point. It's what people do and consistently do in certain environments. And I'll expand upon this more, this aspect of patterned behavior. And then from this patterned behavior, we can make adequate predictions about really anything. So, for example, let's say you are a sociologist and a criminologist, and you want to explain crime and criminal behavior, and you make broad generalizations about specific types of crimes that are more likely to be committed during the summer months. And let's say you are a criminologist and you make the broad generalization that burglary is more likely to be occurring during the summer months. Again, I'm not sure if that's statistically true, but let's just make that broad assumption here. And from this, you start to record data that picks up pattern behavior that supports your statement or previous statement and generalized statement. And from this pattern behavior, you can further predict that every year to come during the summer months, there will be an uptick in crime, particularly burglaries. And you can make those predictions as a criminologist, if that makes sense. And so, stated differently, the goals of science kind of coincide with the sort of processes we go through as scientists in researching something. And it can really be anything at this point. So, to further help you through thinking about the goals of science here and the sort of thought processes that sociologists go through, is the snow analogy. The snow analogy was something that one of my professors who taught women in crime at K-State had taught me, and so now I'm teaching you this. The snow analogy is meant to highlight patterns. But again, going back, when you look at or when it's snowing outside and you see that it's snowing, sometimes when you look outside, you also see footprints. And even maybe when you take a step outside and start to walk in the snow, you follow these footprints, thus kind of creating a pattern that starts to emerge where you start to see where people have walked before you, and you tend to follow that specific pattern and kind of walk in their footprints, right? This is analogy to help explain pattern behavior here, especially how human beings tend to follow other people and somewhat mirror what they are doing in specific environments, stated differently. My own example here is marks in the road. Um, because I tend to drive a lot because I live in Manhattan, but when I have to be on campus in Concordia, I have to drive, which it's an hour and 20-minute drive. And so I tend to see a lot of marks on the road because of that drive. And this is another good analogy, right? Because when I'm driving, I'm seeing marks on the road that signify to me maybe what people were doing on the road, right? And I start to question, oh, why are there so many marks on the road? Was there something up ahead? Was there a deer? Did that person swerve for some specific reason, right? And you start to see that also people tend to drive in in the same lane or certain area of the road, and they tend to follow that pattern behavior over and over and over again. The point of both of these analogies is that it's supposed to reflect, or it does reflect, the aspect of research, and understanding how data works, right? Because from data, we pull patterns, and we tend to, from those patterns, make adequate predictions about something, right? Okay, so getting further into this, it's also important with these first couple weeks to also go through the origins of sociology and where it began as a field. Um, Sociology emerged out of philosophy, fun fact. Um, it started off as philosophy, and then sociology branched off and became its own field off of philosophy. So it began in the 1800s after three major events. Um, it sparked after the Industrial Revolution, the political revolutions, and imperialism. It is a scientific method. And early on, it was used as more so early theorists, and I'll go through this, used armchair philosophy when they researched sociological research or conducted sociological research rather. Um, and so this armchair method kind of helped to birth the field of sociology. And the armchair method that most early sociologists used was just looking around them and making broad generalizations. Looking around them and not really recording anything, just making broad assumptions and broad generalizations about the world around them. And that was really their research. And again, that's called armchair philosophy, and what early sociologists utilized. So, an early individual who is considered the father of sociology and applied on armchair philosophy is Auguste Comte. He believed in positivism. He also he also underscored uh, reform and the aspect of reform. He was big into researching criminals, deviancy during his time, and he was early in considering reforming prisoners. He was the early one of the earliest advocates for prisoners during his time. But according to him, sociologists would reform society, making it a better place to live. So he definitely considered sociology as a positive, as having a positive influence on society and the world. And again, he practiced armchair philosophy. Then you have Herbert Spencer. He is the second founder to sociology. He was so. Again, August Comte, more of a reformer here. Herbert Spencer was a bit harsher. He practiced social Darwinism. He also believed in this idea that was part of social Darwinism of the survival of the fittest. Stated differently, he tended to underscore in a lot of his writings that there were more civilized people and more barbarians. And these civilized people would take over society. They would be the fittest, and they would be able to survive over those who were barbarians. Um, he especially was early on highlighting class here, in a lot of different ways and where people laid out within societies. But again, his early ideas were also rooted in, he's considered also an anthropologist, but he did practice a bit of scientific racism here and how he defined barbarians and those who are civilized. So he did attach race here, more often than not in a lot of his writings. Um, And he too practiced armchair philosophy. So again, looked at the world around him, looked at his own city and local area, and made broad assumptions about what he was seeing. No recorded data in a lot of his writings, and no concrete research just yet. This is until, so you have these early sociologists, again, armchair philosophy. They weren't conducting research at this point in time. They were mostly making observations and writing from those observations. You didn't really see research being conducted until a lot of the Canon 3 sociologists. So um, until Karl Marx, Emil Durkheim, and Max Weber. Karl Marx is one of the considered Canon 3 sociologists. He's considered one of the important sociologists. Um, and if you ever choose to go on and read more about sociology and take more classes, I guarantee that you will have to read a lot of his writings because he is very, very crucial to the field. He wrote a lot about class conflict and consciousness. He also wrote a lot about expression, history, religion, and the like. He highlighted more often than not the work and labor of workers. He highlighted the exploitation of workers. And from this, he highlighted two class systems in a lot of his writings, and he defined them as the bourgeoisie and the proletariats. The bourgeoisie, for Karl Marx, is the capitalists, those who own the means of productions. And that's in his writing. By his words, owns the means of productions. Those are the capitalists. The proletariats, for him, are the exploited workers. Those who work under the bourgeoisie or the bougie, right? The capitalists, and have to essentially produce but don't own any of their products. I hope that makes sense. Um, because again, the bourgeoisie owns everything, according to Marx here. They own all of the products. And so the proletariats don't own anything. Um, then you have Emil Durkheim. Emil Durkheim, there's also some great videos on each of these theorists on YouTube, if you're so curious. Um, Before I get into Emil Durkheim, I'll just briefly show you this. You're seeing my screen, but can't remember. I thought I had it pulled up, but maybe not. Maybe not. I'll post it on Canvas. But there's some good short videos on each of these theorists on YouTube if you are wanting to know more about each of them. Um, okay, so Emil Durkheim discusses in a lot of his writings social facts. Emil Durkheim is also one of the early sociologists who really developed the field of sociology. That's really important here. Like, he wrote a lot on just the methods alone of sociology and how to accurately conduct sociological research and apply sociological imagination. Same with C. Wright Mills. So both of them are pretty crucial here to the methodology portion of sociology. Again, he develops social facts, which I'm just going to briefly skim through the term. I'm just going to throw it out there. You chew on the word because I'm going to further define it and give some examples in the later weeks. I'm just going to throw this example or this definition out here. Just again, chew on it. Social facts for Emil Durkheim are values, cultural norms, and social structures that transcend the individual and can exert social control. It is something, stated differently, that controls us to a certain degree within our environment or can control us. It encompasses values and norms and expectations that we sometimes don't realize are there, in other words. Um, he really underscores this term within his research on suicide and his study of suicide, and how during his time he was recording, again, conducting data. He wasn't conducting armchair philosophy here. He was conducting research and he was recording data. Um, but he was analyzing the rates of suicide and the increase in suicide. And from this sort of analysis, he came up with anomie, the term anomie, another term that I'll get into in later weeks. But for now, anomie refers to the feeling of isolation. And for Emil Durkheim, he was seeing a lot of people during his time feeling isolated, isolated from their community and society. And from this, he determined that if a person experiences anomie, that increases their likelihood to commit suicide. Pretty good analysis and conclusion there. Of feeling isolated within a society, thus you're feeling disconnected. Thus you feel less tied to that society as an individual. That's what he underscores within his research. And a lot of his research isn't just highlighting it's highlighting an individual in their environment, but it's also highlighting feelings, how they're feeling in their environment, which is also crucial to his research. Um, Emil Durkheim also discusses division of labor and how labor has evolved across history. Within this research, he develops the two important terms, mechanical and organic solidarity. I'm going to stop it there because I will be discussing these terms in the later weeks, and they're very crucial to Emil Durkheim. But again, just chew on the terms for now because I'll be defining them later. Um, the last theorist to note for this first week is Max Weber. Max Weber was an early sociologist who took a lot of inspiration from Karl Marx. A lot of inspiration. When you're reading his work, it is very reminiscent of Marx's work. That's because he pulled a lot of he was very much inspired by Marx here. But he kind of disagreed with Marx on certain things. So Marx, again, highlights two forms of class systems. He highlights two groups, stated differently. He highlights the bourgeoisie and the proletariats. He doesn't really account for other groups here. He just highlights that there are two, and that there are just one types of bourgeoisie. For Max Weber, he kind of separates himself from Marx here because he makes an argument that, yeah, there are bourgeoisie or capitalists, but there are capitalists who are on like different levels. So there's a capitalist here, but there's also a capitalist that makes more money than this capitalist or this bourgeoisie. And so there are levels to different class systems for Max Weber. And part of this like argument is the fact that he tends to highlight that, yeah, there are like managers, but there are managers who manage those managers. And there's different levels to that. And there are different bosses that don't own the whole corporation, they just own a part of that corporation. That's he highlights this, and that's very crucial to a lot of his writing points here, and how he this kind of separates himself from Karl Marx. Um, so separate to this, he also highlights religion as an aspect that is that he ties to labor. So he highlights in his writings, Capitalism and Protestant Christianity, the aspect of feeling guilt and how feeling guilty is tied to both labor and work. So feeling guilty that you're not doing enough in your job, and also the feeling of guilt is something that arises in religion. Feeling guilty that you aren't being Christian enough, or you aren't practicing your faith as good as the other person, right? And so he just highlights that feeling of guilt that can be found in both, as well as the work ethic, which is tied to this idea, right, of feeling guilty, and conducting holy work, or the aspect of no miracles, all tied into this sort of feeling of, am I doing enough as a laborer, or am I doing enough as a Christian, right? Or a religious person? That's essentially what he's writing here. He also highlights the aspect of community work and how community work arises in both religion, and so you have community and community ties in religion, which is true, and that whole culture of religion, as well as labor and work, and how we tend to find little our own community in where we work, which is also true. So he's just highlighting that human connection that can be found in both environments. Um, Last to note here is an important term that he discusses in a lot of his writing, and it's the spirit of capitalism. It's the aspect of taking time to invest in capital for him. And investing in capital is not only tied to money, but it's also for Weber tied to time. How much time we spend in investing in capital or working and laboring. So that's also what he highlights in a lot of his writing. Okay, this is the first lecture video. That's all I'm going to be discussing for now, but I'll post the other video on culture here pretty soon. So have a good day.